The Kansas wind cut right through my flannel shirt, but I didn't step back from the open doorway. It was midnight. The temperature hovered near zero, turning the slush on my driveway into black ice. Standing under the flickering amber porch light was my father, Richard Ralphie, the man who had spent my entire 32 years of life demanding respect and projecting flawless authority, was currently shivering in a thin wool coat. He rubbed his bare hands together. His eyes darted from the frozen concrete to my face. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't offer a single word about the 6 months of dead silence between us. He just leaned forward, his voice cracking. "Jonah, I need $250,000. If I don't wire the funds by morning, they are taking everything." I stared at him. I didn't feel pity. I felt the icy lock of a trap finally snapping shut. Before I tell you why I stood there blocking the warmth of my home from a desperate man, welcome to Linda Vengeance. If you have ever realized your own flesh and blood views you as an option rather than a priority, this story is for you. Drop your age and where you are listening from in the comments below. Let us see who else knows the sting of being the disposable child. Now let me take you back 6 months to a Tuesday afternoon. I was exactly 14 days away from marrying Sarah. We had booked a beautiful botanical garden on the edge of Wichita, stretching our savings to cover the deposit. I sat at our kitchen island, a silver pen in hand, checking off the final catering responses. The phone buzzed against the marble counter. The screen flashed my mother's name, Helen. "Jonah, sweetie," she said. Her tone carried that specific breezy lightness she always used when she was about to dodge accountability. "We are going to have a little scheduling issue with the ceremony." I set the silver pen down. "The wedding is in 2 weeks, Mom. The date has been set for a year." I know she sighed, though she sounded more inconvenienced than regretful. But Brittany's baby shower falls on that exact same weekend. Her nursery reveal is scheduled for Saturday afternoon. It is terrible timing, but you understand, right? A new baby is the future of this family. That is the priority right now. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of equating my marriage to a nursery reveal, a distinct sound echoed through the receiver. A crisp, sharp pop, followed by the fizz of overflowing liquid. Champagne. Then came the booming laughter of Todd, my sister's husband, echoing in the background. They were not just calling to cancel. They were hosting a pre-shower celebration at that exact moment. They were raising glasses to the golden child, while casually informing me they would be leaving my bride with a table of empty chairs. "Your father says you will have plenty of other milestones," Helen added, her voice muffling slightly, as if she were covering the receiver. "We will send a nice gift." I didn't yell. I didn't demand an explanation or list the sacrifices I had made for their approval over the past 3 decades. The realization simply calcified in my chest. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, cutting off the background laughter. The silence that settled into my kitchen was heavy. It was broken by the sound of the front door unlocking. Sarah walked in wearing her blue hospital scrubs. She looked exhausted from her long shift, but her tired eyes brightened when she saw me. She dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. "Did you finish the seating chart?" she asked, walking over to wrap her arms around my shoulders. I turned on the bar stool to face her. "We need to rework Table 1. My parents are not coming. Neither is Brittany or Todd." Sarah froze. Her hands slowly slid off my shoulders. She didn't ask why. She just looked at my rigid posture, reading the betrayal etched into my jawline. Her face fractured tears pooling in her dark eyes. She wasn't crying because her wedding photos would be missing my side of the family. She was devastated because she was marrying a man whose parents treated him like a disposable asset. I pulled her against my chest, staring over her shoulder at the discarded seating chart. The battle lines were drawn, but the real war had not even started. The Wichita Botanical Garden was bathed in the warm golden light of late afternoon, smelling of crushed cedar and blooming jasmine. It was the kind of pristine June day brides pray for. But as I stood at the front of the aisle, waiting for the string quartet to begin playing, the air felt tight, heavy with a silent, suffocating judgment. Right in the front row, directly in my line of sight, sat Table 1. It was a glaring physical manifestation of my family's priorities. Sarah's side of the aisle was packed. Her relatives squeezed into their white wooden folding chairs, fanning themselves with programs, murmuring happily. My side was a hollow expanse. The first 2 rows remained entirely empty. I watched the eyes of my extended family members, the aunts and second cousins scattered in the back rows, darting toward those vacant seats. They leaned in close to one another, hands cupped over mouths. The whispers drifted over the manicured lawn, an undercurrent of pity that burned the back of my neck. They were wondering why the groom's parents could not be bothered to show up. I kept my chin level, refusing to let the humiliation register on my face. My gaze dropped to the round banquet table set for the immediate family near the reception tent. Months earlier, my father had insisted on custom place settings. "A man's name is his brand, Jonah," he had lectured me over dinner, sliding a heavy invoice across the table. He demanded solid brass name cards, polished to a mirror shine, heavy enough to anchor a centerpiece. Now a sudden gust of wind swept through the garden. It rattled the canvas of the reception tent and swept across the empty table. I watched my father's heavy custom brass name card slide across the white linen. It teetered on the edge for a fraction of a second before tumbling over. It hit the grass and skidded off the patio landing, face down in the dark, damp topsoil of a flower bed. I stared at it. I did not walk over to pick it up. I let it sit in the dirt. The string quartet shifted their melody, playing the opening notes of the bridal march, and the whispers instantly ceased. The guests stood. I forced my attention away from the vacant chairs and looked down the aisle. Sarah appeared at the edge of the stone path. The sight of her radiant and smiling, despite the fracture in my chest, anchored me. I took a slow, deep breath, compartmentalizing the betrayal. I locked the pain into a tight box in the back of my mind and focused entirely on the woman walking toward me. During the vows, the pacing of the world slowed down. When I held her hands, I promised to build a foundation that would never crack under pressure. I promised to prioritize her above all else. Those words were not just traditional scripts to me. They were a sworn oath to break the cycle of the family I was born into and protect the family I was choosing. For those brief 20 minutes, the empty chairs ceased to matter. The garden was quiet, intimate, and ours. The reception kicked off with an easy, celebratory rhythm. Jazz music drifted from the speakers, blending with the clinking of champagne flutes and the low hum of conversation. We navigated the room, shaking hands, hugging Sarah's relatives, and accepting their warm congratulations. I played the part of the joyful groom flawlessly. About an hour into the dinner service, I stepped away to the outdoor patio to grab a moment of quiet. I leaned against the stone railing, taking a sip of bourbon. The ice clinked against the crystal glass. My phone vibrated in my tuxedo pocket. I pulled it out. The bright screen illuminated the dim patio. It was a group text from Todd, my brother-in-law. Todd was a local residential realtor who treated his marriage to my sister as a permanent lottery ticket. He wore too much cologne, drove leased luxury sedans, and possessed a deeply ingrained sense of entitlement funded entirely by my father's logistics company. I tapped the screen. A high-definition photograph loaded. It was a wide shot of a massive, sunlit living room. Brittany stood in the center wearing a designer maternity dress surrounded by towers of pastel blue gift boxes. She was beaming. Right beside her, commanding the center of the frame, was my father. Richard wore his signature tailored blazer, a wide, triumphant grin plastered across his face. He was in the middle of handing Brittany a small velvet box containing what looked like keys to a brand new luxury SUV. Beneath the image was a text from Todd. "Sorry we missed the party, bro. Between the shower and running the logistics business, things are crazy. I am so exhausted. Seriously need a vacation to Cabo soon. Catch up later." I stared at the glowing text. It was not an apology. It was a calculated, petty victory lap. It was Todd asserting his dominance, reminding me that while I was standing in a rented garden in Wichita, they were swimming in Richard's wealth. Furthermore, Todd complaining about needing a vacation due to running the business was a joke. I knew for a fact Todd had not stepped foot inside the logistics company headquarters in 3 years. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. A dozen different responses spiked in my mind. I could call them out. I could ruin their celebratory evening just as they had tried to ruin mine. I could send a scathing reply that would start a bitter, drawn-out family feud. I took another sip of the bourbon, letting the sharp liquid burn down my throat. I looked back through the glass doors of the patio. Sarah was on the dance floor, laughing as her father twirled her around. I looked down at the phone. I tapped delete. I went into the settings and blocked Todd's number. I blocked Brittany's number. I blocked my mother and my father. I severed the digital cord with a few quick swipes. I slid the cold metal device back into my pocket and walked back inside, choosing the warmth of my new wife over the toxic bait of my past. I chose peace. But peace is a fragile, temporary illusion. The timeline snaps forward. 6 months vanish in a blink. The warm jasmine breeze of the botanical garden is replaced by the biting, bitter wind of a Kansas winter. The jazz music is replaced by the sound of frozen branches scraping against the gutters. I stand in the doorway of my home, the warm yellow light from the hallway spilling out onto the frozen concrete of the porch. The man standing in that light bears almost no resemblance to the smug, triumphant figure in Todd's photograph. Richard Ralphie looks 10 years older. The tailored wool coat hangs loosely on his frame, suggesting he has dropped a significant amount of weight. His silver hair, usually combed back with precision, is windblown and chaotic. His jaw trembles, though whether from the freezing temperature or sheer terror, I cannot tell. The custom leather shoes he wears are scuffed and covered in gray, freezing slush. He shifts his weight, the ice cracking beneath his soles. Jonah, I need $250,000. If I don't wire the funds by morning, they are taking everything. His eyes are wide, glassy, and stripped of every ounce of pride he ever wielded against me. He looks at me not as a son, but as a lifeline. I stand still, the freezing wind biting at my collar, and study his fractured expression. A deep, analytical curiosity cuts through my residual anger. What could possibly strip an arrogant man of his pride so fast? What kind of catastrophic failure could bring the untouchable Richard Ralphie to my doorstep in the dead of winter, begging the son he discarded for $250,000? The wind whipped past Richard, pushing a bitter draft into the foyer. He did not wait for an invitation. He stepped across the threshold, his heavy leather Oxfords crunching against the hardwood floor. He bypassed the tiled entryway and marched directly onto the cream-woven rug Sarah had spent weeks picking out for our new living room. Dark, freezing sludge melted from his soles, sinking deep into the pristine fibers. The black ice turned to dirty water, staining the immaculate fabric. He did not look down. He did not notice the stain he was leaving behind. He never noticed the collateral damage he caused. Richard unbuttoned his coat with trembling fingers. $250,000, he repeated, his voice tight and breathless. I need it by 8 a.m. tomorrow, Jonah. I closed the front door, sealing out the harsh Kansas winter. I stood a few feet away, studying his posture. The man was practically vibrating. His skin was pale, pulling tight across his cheekbones, and despite the freezing temperature outside, a thin layer of sweat gathered at his hairline. Where is the money going? He waved a hand, a frantic, dismissive gesture, meant to brush away my inquiry. Cash flow shortfall. The logistics market took a hit this quarter. Fuel costs are up across the board. Accounts receivable are lagging behind our projections. I have a quarterly audit on Friday morning with the venture capital firm. If my silent partner sees the operating account dipping into the red, he will trigger a default clause. He will pull his backing. The company will fold, and everything I built will vanish. I listened to his excuses quietly, picking apart the lies hidden between his panicked lines. A standard cash flow dip does not send a prideful CEO to his estranged son's house at midnight. A standard financial shortfall is handled through credit extensions, bridge loans, or a simple call to the bank. The sheer terror radiating from his rigid shoulders told a different story. He was not trying to save a struggling business. He was trying to cover up an active crime before the auditors arrived. He needed my cash to fill a crater he had dug himself. When I remained silent, Richard shifted his strategy. The panic morphed into a hollow imitation of authority. "You are my son," he said, puffing out his chest. "I put a roof over your head for 18 years. I paid for your clothes and put food on your table. Family sticks together when things get tough. I am asking you to step up. Do your duty." The word duty hung in the warm air. It tasted like ash. My mind snapped back 14 years. I was 18 years old. It was 2 a.m. on a school night. The rest of the house was dark, but I was sitting in my father's home office, illuminated only by the harsh glare of a heavy desktop monitor. I was hunched over complex accounting software, balancing the logistics company ledgers because Richard refused to hire a full-time bookkeeper. He claimed it built character. He claimed he was teaching me the value of hard work. While I traced missing invoices, reconciled bank statements, and categorized overhead expenses until my eyes burned, the front door swung open. Brittany strolled in, laughing loudly, followed by her new boyfriend, Todd. They had just returned from a joyride in her brand-new luxury convertible, a vehicle purchased directly through the company expense account under the guise of an executive fleet car. They did not work for the business. They did not know how to read a basic balance sheet. They simply reaped the financial rewards while I carried the structural weight in the shadows. That late-night education had not earned me any respect or affection, but it had given me something far more dangerous. It gave me a fundamental, microscopic understanding of exactly how my father structured his enterprise. It gave me the blueprint to his empire. I pulled myself out of the memory and refocused on the man standing on my ruined rug. "I am a corporate restructuring consultant," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even, devoid of any warmth or hostility. "I do not write blind checks. I assess failing assets." Richard blinked, caught off guard by the clinical response. "This is not a client consultation, Jonah. This is your family. This is your legacy. This is a request for $250,000 in liquid capital," I countered. "If you want my money, you play by my rules." His jaw tightened. He hated losing control, especially to the son he viewed as beneath him. "What rules?" "I will consider floating the loan," I said, measuring every single syllable to ensure he heard the finality in my voice. "But I require full, unrestricted administrative access to the primary financial ledgers, every account, every expense report, every wire transfer and payroll document from the last 5 years. I want the master login credentials right now." Richard hesitated. A flicker of genuine fear crossed his eyes. He knew his books were dirty. He knew there were things hidden in those digital files that could ruin him. But he was trapped in a corner of his own making. He was out of time, out of credit, and completely out of options. More importantly, he still viewed me through the lens of the past. He still saw the quiet, obedient teenager staring at a spreadsheet in the dark. He thought I was just doing standard due diligence to feel important. He thought he could easily outsmart me. "Fine," Richard snapped, reaching into his inner coat pocket. He pulled out his smartphone, his thumbs flying clumsily across the glowing screen. He forwarded an email directly to my personal address. It contained the encrypted portal link and the administrative passwords for the entire corporate network. "You have until 8 a.m., he warned, trying to summon a final shred of parental intimidation. "Do not make me regret trusting you." He turned around his ruined shoes, tracking another long layer of black sludge across the floor. He opened the front door, welcoming the freezing wind back into the house, and stepped out into the night. He did not say goodbye. He did not offer a single word of thanks. I stood in the foyer, listening to the roar of his luxury sedan starting in the driveway. The headlights swept across the frosted windows, fading down the dark suburban street until the neighborhood was silent again. I looked down at the mud staining the pristine cream rug. It was a perfect physical representation of what my family always did to me. They walked into my life, left their filth behind, and expected me to quietly clean it up. Not this time. I walked past the living room and headed straight for my home office. The house was dead quiet. Sarah was fast asleep upstairs, unaware that the man who had humiliated her on her wedding day was now begging for mercy. I sat down at my glass desk. The leather chair creaked softly under my weight. I opened the silver laptop. The screen flared to life, casting a cold blue glow across my face. I clicked on the forwarded email. I copied the administrative password and pasted it into the secure portal. The loading circle spun for 3 long seconds. Then the dashboard materialized. 10 years of corporate data expense reports and hidden transactions sat right at my fingertips. Richard thought he was securing a financial lifeline. He did not realize he had just handed me the weapon that would dismantle his entire life. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The forensic hunt had officially begun. The digital clock in the corner of my monitor rolled over to 5 a.m. My coffee had turned into cold, bitter sludge hours ago. The Kansas sunrise was beginning to bleed through the horizontal blinds of my office window, casting thin, gray shadows across the floorboards. I rubbed my eyes, fighting the familiar, gritty sting of sleep deprivation. For the past 5 hours, I had been submerged in the digital nervous system of my father's logistics firm. Richard had blamed his impending ruin on macroeconomic factors. He stood on my ruined rug and spun a tale about soaring diesel fuel costs, delayed shipping contracts, and a sluggish freight market. He lied. The numbers told a profoundly different story. As a restructuring consultant, my job is to diagnose corporate disease. Usually, business failures stem from incompetence or market shifts. This was different. This was deliberate financial sabotage. I pulled the general ledger, isolating the primary operating credit line. Revenue from the shipping routes remained remarkably stable over the past 3 years. The incoming cash flow was healthy. The fatal bleed originated entirely from the accounts payable column, specifically categorized under administrative overhead. I ran a series of pivot tables, sorting the outgoing capital by vendor and authorization code. A toxic pattern emerged almost instantly. Richard was bypassing standard accounting protocols. He had authorized a secondary executive expense account tethered directly to the corporate credit line. Instead of using incoming revenue to pay the company's vendors or service their freight trucks, he was siphoning commercial debt to float a shadow budget. I clicked on the itemized statements for the executive account. The screen flooded with transactions that had nothing to do with regional logistics. There were recurring payments to a luxury vehicle leasing agency. There were enormous monthly drafts routed to a high-end residential mortgage lender. There were retail purchases at designer boutiques, country club membership dues, and 5-star resort reservations. The venture capital firm funding the business believed their money was expanding a fleet of freight trucks. In reality, their capital was sustaining Brittany and Todd's lavish entitlement. I continued scrolling, my pulse steadying into a slow, cold rhythm. The emotional sting of my father's midnight ambush faded, replaced by the clinical precision of an investigator building a prosecution. I filtered the transactions by date, narrowing my search window to the month of June, the month of my wedding. A specific line item caught my attention. It was a staggering charge submitted to a premium Wichita event planning and catering service. I clicked the attached PDF invoice to view the itemized receipt. My eyes scanned the breakdown. 24 bottles of imported vintage champagne, custom floral centerpieces featuring rare orchids, artisanal hors d'oeuvres, and a multi-tiered fondant cake. The event description was typed clearly at the top of the invoice: Brittany baby shower and nursery reveal. I checked the timestamp on the credit card authorization. It was processed on the exact Saturday afternoon of my wedding weekend. It was the same afternoon Helen had called me, her voice breezy and unapologetic, claiming they had a scheduling conflict. They had popped that champagne while I sat alone at my kitchen island, crossing their names off my seating chart. The betrayal was no longer just an emotional wound. It was documented in black and white text on a corporate ledger. They did not just abandon their son to celebrate their golden child. They used a failing business to fund their favoritism. They charged their betrayal to a corporate credit account, and now 6 months later, Richard wanted me to bail him out because the bill had finally come due. I closed the PDF and dug deeper into the architecture of the fraud. The luxury expenses explained the cash flow drain, but they did not explain the sheer magnitude of the missing capital. $250,000 was a steep shortfall, even for a man funding his daughter's extravagant lifestyle. There had to be an anchor dragging the ship down. I switched my focus to the wire transfer logs. I deployed the structural optimization techniques I used for my corporate clients, tracking the digital breadcrumbs left behind by large-scale money movements. I bypassed the standard domestic accounts and started searching for encrypted routing numbers. Within 20 minutes, I found the anchor. Richard had initiated a series of systematic outbound wire transfers over the past 18 months. The funds were bleeding out of the corporate holding account and vanishing into 3 distinct limited liability companies. I ran a quick background query on the LLCs. They were registered in states with strict corporate privacy shields, utilizing registered agent services to hide the true ownership identities. This was not merely reckless spending. This was premeditated asset concealment. Richard knew the logistics company was sinking under the weight of his embezzlement. He was actively draining the remaining liquid capital, hiding the cash offshore before his silent partner triggered an audit. He wanted my money to temporarily plug the hole in the operating account, buying himself enough time to extract the last remaining drops of value before letting the business collapse. I hit the print command, generating physical copies of the offshore wire logs, the forged expense reports, and the catering receipt. The laser printer in the corner of my office hummed to life, churning out the warm pages of my digital dossier. Just as the final page slid into the output tray, the hinges of my office door creased open. Sarah stood in the doorway. She wore a soft gray robe, her hair tied up in a loose knot. She held a steaming ceramic mug of coffee in one hand and a small stack of mail in the other. "You have been up all night," she murmured, stepping into the room. She glanced at the glowing monitors, taking in the chaotic spread of spreadsheets and financial data. "Did he really give you access to everything?" "He handed me the rope," I replied, organizing the freshly printed documents into a neat, sharp stack. "And I just figured out exactly how he plans to hang himself." Sarah walked over and set the coffee mug on a coaster near my keyboard. She looked at the dark circles under my eyes, her expression softening with quiet concern. She set the stack of mail on the glass surface of the desk. "I grabbed it from the foyer table on my way to the kitchen," she said. "I think the post office forwarded a few things from your old apartment." I nodded, sipping the fresh, scalding coffee. My eyes fell on the top envelope in the stack. It was a standard business envelope marked with red, urgent lettering across the front. The return address belonged to a national debt collection agency based out of Chicago. I frowned. I carried 0 personal debt. My credit cards were paid in full every month, and the mortgage on our new home was perfectly current. I set the coffee down and picked up the envelope. I slid my thumb under the paper flap, tearing it open. I unfolded the thick official letterhead. My gaze locked onto the bold black text at the top of the page. It was a final demand notice for an outstanding commercial equipment loan. The principal balance was staggering, far exceeding the $250,000 Richard had begged for on my porch. I read the primary borrower name printed beneath the balance. It was my name. Jonah Ralphie. My heart slammed against my ribs. I read the text again, my mind struggling to process the impossible information. The loan originated 3 years ago. According to the document, I had personally guaranteed a fleet of commercial freight trucks. I scanned the mailing address section. The debt collector had addressed the letter to my current marital home. However, right beneath my name, the original address of record was listed. It was my childhood address, the house where Richard and Helen lived. I stared at the paper, the harsh reality freezing the blood in my veins. I never signed for a commercial loan. I never authorized a freight equipment purchase. But the debt was legally attached to my identity, and the collectors had finally tracked me down. The forensic hunt was no longer just about exposing my father's corporate embezzlement. The threat was inside my house. The crisp white paper trembled slightly in my grip under the harsh glow of my desk lamp. The bold black ink of the collection notice seemed to burn into my retina. A commercial equipment loan origination document, 3 years old. The principal balance listed at the bottom of the page rivaled the cost of a small suburban neighborhood. My name, Jonah Ralphie, sat neatly in the borrower section. Right below it, the last 4 digits of my Social Security number stared back at me. I traced the numbers with my index finger. The skin on my hand felt cold. A dull ache began to throb behind my temples. My mind worked through the mechanics of the fraud with ruthless efficiency. 3 years ago, I was 29, living in a cramped downtown apartment building, my consulting firm from the ground up. I was nowhere near the logistics industry. But Richard had my birth certificate. He had my Social Security card locked in the fireproof safe in his home office, a relic from my childhood that I never thought to reclaim. He had weaponized my identity. I read the fine print at the bottom of the page. The collection agency noted that previous correspondence had been sent to a primary billing address. I recognized the street name immediately. It was not a residential home. It was a sterile, generic strip mall on the outskirts of Topeka, a location notorious for hosting cheap virtual office spaces and registered agent mailboxes. Richard had established a shell limited liability company linking it to my stolen identity and routed all the billing statements to a ghost address. He intercepted the mail for 36 months, keeping me blind to the financial anchor tied around my neck. The only reason the truth had finally surfaced was because the shell company stopped paying the monthly premiums. The loan had defaulted. The bank sold the toxic debt to a Chicago collection agency. Those collectors did not care about virtual mailboxes. They used standard skip trace software, scanning public utility records and property deeds until they found my newly registered Wichita marital address. I booted up the web browser on my second monitor. The collection notice included an automated portal for debtors to review their account details. I typed in the reference number and my zip code. The screen loaded, presenting a dashboard of overdue penalties and accrued interest. I ignored the terrifying numbers and clicked the tab labeled Original Executed Contracts. A high-resolution PDF loaded onto my screen. It was the master promissory note for the commercial freight trucks. I scrolled directly to the bottom of the 4th page, hunting for the signature line. My eyes locked onto the digital scan of the ink. It read, Jonah Ralphie. But it was not my handwriting. The letters were pressed deep into the paper, leaning at a harsh rightward slant. The loops on the vowels were compressed, and the final letter trailed off in a sharp, aggressive slash. I knew that penmanship. I had seen it every year of my childhood on cheap greeting cards. My father never bought presents. He handed me a folded card with a $20 bill inside, always signing it with the exact same heavy slan-ministered cursive. Happy birthday. Do your chores. Richard. He did not even bother to hire a professional forger. He just sat at his mahogany desk, signed his son's name to a fraudulent commercial note, and walked away. The air in the home office grew thin. The narrative Richard had spun on my frozen porch just hours prior began to disintegrate. He was not a desperate businessman trying to save his logistics empire from a temporary cash flow crisis. He was a cornered criminal. The venture capital audit scheduled for Friday morning was not just going to expose his embezzlement. The auditors would trace the phantom equipment loans. They would flag the forged signatures. They would hand the file over to federal regulators. Richard did not need $250,000 to meet payroll. He needed the cash to buy his way out of a federal forgery indictment. I leaned back in the leather chair, letting the silence of the early morning wash over me. The emotional wound of my parents skipping my wedding had driven me to open the financial ledgers. I had expected to find greed. I had expected to find arrogance. I had not expected to find a felony. The betrayal had crossed an invisible boundary, shifting from a painful family dispute into the realm of severe criminal liability. I needed to secure the digital footprint before Richard realized I was hunting him. I toggled back to the corporate network portal he had unlocked for me. I bypassed the standard accounting software and accessed the back-end server logs. If Richard had used company computers to initiate the loan applications, the network would have captured the activity. I filtered the server requests by the origination date listed on the promissory note. The data populated in neat chronological rows. I found the matching IP addresses. The loan application had been submitted directly from the primary terminal in Richard's corner office. The digital metadata tethered the forgery directly to his physical location. I connected a solid-state encrypted drive to my laptop. I highlighted the server logs, the offshore wire transfers, the fake expense reports, and the scanned promissory note. I dragged the entire batch of files into the secure folder. A progress bar appeared, estimating 3 minutes until the transfer completed. The silence of the room shattered. My phone vibrated rapidly against the glass surface of the desk, startling me. The screen illuminated the dim space. The caller identification displayed Brittany's name. I stared at the glowing rectangle. I had blocked her number months ago, immediately following the wedding incident. She must have realized she was restricted and resorted to calling from a different line, bypassing the block. It was almost 6 in the morning. The golden child did not wake up before sunrise unless something was terribly wrong. I reached out and pressed the green accept button. I brought the receiver to my ear and said nothing. Jonah Brittany gasped. Her voice was thick, wet, and frantic. She was crying hysterically, the sound of her jagged breathing echoing through the speaker. "Jonah, please tell me you are going to wire Dad the money." I watched the progress bar on my computer screen slowly fill with green. "Why are you calling me, Brittany?" "Dad just called, Todd," she sobbed, her words stumbling over one another. "He is panicking. He said the logistics company is going under, and you are the only one who can inject the capital to save it. You have to do it. You have to send him the funds today." I kept my voice flat, stripping away any trace of empathy. Richard ran the business into the ground. That is his failure. It has nothing to do with me. "You do not understand," she wailed, the pitch of her voice climbing into a shrill register. "If the company folds, we lose the house." I paused. The puzzle pieces snapped into perfect alignment. "Why would you lose your house?" I asked, feigning ignorance to let her dig her own grave. "Todd is a highly successful residential realtor. You have your own income." The line went quiet for a fraction of a second, save for her wet sniffles. "Todd has not closed a real estate deal in 2 years, she confessed, the panic overriding her usual pride. "The market shifted. We got behind. Dad has been paying our mortgage directly through the corporate accounts to help us out until things turn around. If he loses the company, the bank will foreclose on our property next month. We have a new baby, Jonah. You cannot let us go homeless." She weaponized her tears, wrapping her financial entitlement in the guise of maternal desperation. She expected me to crumble at the mention of my infant nephew. She expected me to empty my savings account to subsidize the very same luxury lifestyle she had flaunted while skipping my wedding. I looked at the catering receipt on my desk. 24 bottles of imported champagne, custom floral centerpieces, paid for by the company Richard was now begging me to save. "You want me to wire $250,000 to cover your mortgage?" I stated, summarizing her frantic plea. "It is for the family," she pleaded, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We need you. You are the only one who can fix this. Please do the right thing." I watched the progress bar hit 100%. The secure drive pinged, confirming the encrypted data transfer was successful. I safely ejected the hardware and slipped it into my pocket. "You chose your priorities 6 months ago," I told her. The words were cold, precise, and final. Now you get to live with them. "Wait, Jonah, please, you cannot just—" I lowered the phone and ended the call. The dial tone cut her off mid-sentence. I set the device face down on the glass desk and exhaled a long, steady breath. The morning sun finally crested the horizon, flooding the office with bright, harsh light. The shadows retreated. Everything was entirely clear. Richard thought he could outsmart me. Brittany thought she could manipulate me. They both operated under the delusion that I was still the discarded son, desperate for a seat at their table. They had no idea I had just downloaded the exact coordinates of their ruin. I picked up the forged promissory note and placed it inside a manila folder. I tapped the edges against the desk, aligning the paper perfectly. I held the detonator to their entire fake reality. The forensic phase of my investigation was over. It was time to start dismantling the empire. I silenced my phone and pushed the device to the far edge of the glass desk. Brittany and her manufactured tears held zero currency in this room. The encrypted drive in my pocket was already heavy with the forgery evidence, but her frantic confession regarding the mortgage revealed a brand new layer of systemic rot. If Richard was actively paying their residential mortgage through the corporate accounts, he needed a mechanism to clean the outgoing cash. You cannot simply wire logistics operating funds to a residential bank without triggering an automatic audit flag during tax season. You need a classification. You need a paper trail. I navigated away from the general ledger and accessed the human resources portal. I bypassed the active driver manifests, the warehouse management rosters, and the regional dispatchers. I pulled up the executive compensation profiles. Right at the top of the screen, nestled directly underneath Richard's bloated CEO package, were two familiar names, Todd and Brittany. Their official corporate titles were listed as Senior Logistics Consultants. I clicked on their active compensation files. My jaw locked tight as the numbers populated the screen. They were each drawing a base salary of $90,000 a year. $180,000 of venture capital funding was being drained annually to subsidize a couple who did not know the difference between a freight manifest and a grocery list. I checked their employment start dates. The fraud stretched back 5 years. Nearly $1 million had been stolen from the silent partner, classified under phantom administrative wages. Todd and Brittany were ghost employees. They collected direct deposits, accumulated health benefits, and accrued paid time off for a logistics firm they had never actually visited. I dug into the itemized travel expense accounts linked to Todd's profile. I remembered the group chat from my wedding day. I remembered Todd complaining about being exhausted from running the business and needing a vacation to Cabo. I pulled my phone back across the desk, opened my blocked messages folder, and retrieved the archived chat history. I scrolled past the baby shower photos and found a text from Todd dated 14 months ago. He had sent a picture holding a premium margarita on a white sand beach, bragging about a grueling site inspection in Mexico. I typed the exact date of that text into the corporate expense search bar. The results populated instantly, laying the fraud bare. Todd had submitted a reimbursement claim for a 5-day stay at a 5-star resort in Cabo San Lucas. He categorized the seaside cabana rentals, the premium tequila flights, and the jet ski excursions as client retention operations. The receipts were pristine, uploaded in high resolution. Right beside the upload timestamp was the administrative approval signature. Richard had authorized the reimbursement the very next morning. This was not just terrible business management. It was systemic, documented theft. Defrauding a federally backed venture capital firm using ghost employees carried severe criminal penalties. I downloaded every single W-2, every fabricated expense report, and the digital metadata timestamps proving Richard's administrative approval. I compiled the files into a new folder labeled Federal Evidence. My phone vibrated again, the sudden buzzing shattering the quiet focus of my office. I glanced at the caller identification. It was Sarah. I answered immediately, expecting her to be on a quick coffee break. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone light. "Jonah." Her voice was low, vibrating with a tightly coiled fury I had rarely heard from her. She was speaking in a hushed, sharp whisper, likely standing in a private stairwell. "Your mother is here." I stopped typing. The blood in my veins turned to ice. "Here? You mean at your office?" Yes. She bypassed the security desk by claiming it was a family medical emergency. She ambushed me right in the middle of the main lobby. Sarah worked as a senior analyst at a prestigious wealth management firm downtown. It was a high-pressure, immaculate environment where reputation, discretion, and professionalism were everything. Helen showing up unannounced was a calculated, deliberate violation of Sarah's professional boundaries. "What did she say?" I asked, my grip tightening around the phone until my knuckles turned white. Sarah let out a sharp, incredulous breath. She put on this tragic, weeping mother act in front of my colleagues. She grabbed my arm and started loud whispering about how you were trying to ruin the family. She told me you were making unreasonable financial demands, acting greedy, and holding a petty grudge over the wedding. She actually tried to warn me about you, Jonah. She said she wanted to protect our new marriage from your toxic behavior before you dragged me down with you. The strategy was sickeningly clear. Helen was launching a preemptive strike. She knew the financial house of cards was collapsing, so she tried to isolate me. She tried to poison the one person I trusted, hoping Sarah would become frightened by the drama and pressure me into backing down. Helen wanted Sarah to convince me to sign over the bailout money to keep the peace. I stood up from my desk, my chair rolling back against the hardwood floor. What did you do? I did not cause a scene, Sarah replied, her tone turning razor sharp. I looked at her hand on my arm. I told her if she ever stepped foot in my building again, I would have security escort her out in handcuffs. I told her I know exactly who my husband is, and I know exactly what kind of people abandoned us at the altar. Then I turned around, swiped my badge, and walked into the elevator while she stood there with her mouth open. A profound wave of respect and relief washed over me. For my entire life, my family had tried to isolate me. They had tried to frame me as the problem, the difficult child, the ungrateful son. Helen had severely underestimated Sarah's loyalty, just as Richard had underestimated my intelligence. They thought they could divide and conquer. Instead, they had just fortified the wall between us and them. "Are you okay?" I asked, leaning against the edge of the glass desk. "I am furious," she corrected her breathing, steadying into a calm, dangerous rhythm. "I am furious that they think they can manipulate us. I am furious that she tried to humiliate me at my job to save her own skin. We are not giving them a single dime, Jonah. Do you hear me? Nothing. We are not giving them a dime," I confirmed, looking at the blinking cursor on my monitor. "We are going to give them exactly what they earned." I ended the call and set the phone down. The isolation tactic had failed. Sarah and I were an unbreakable, unified front. The emotional, lingering doubt I had carried regarding my family dissolved entirely, replaced by a cold, righteous clarity. They were not just hurting me anymore. They were actively targeting my wife. I turned my attention back to the corporate network. I had the ghost payroll. I had the forged equipment loan. I had the fraudulent expense reports. But to ensure Richard could never recover, to ensure the trap was inescapable, I needed to review the one entity that terrified every corrupt CEO in the country. I needed to look at his federal tax filings. I clicked open the external accounting portal, ready to dig into the deepest, darkest corner of his empire. I closed the human resources portal and opened the encrypted drive containing the corporate tax returns. In my professional practice, I employ a highly specialized framework known as Tax Alpha. It is a legitimate, rigorous methodology used to strategically structure a business entity to maximize long-term value through optimal legal tax efficiency. True Tax Alpha requires immense discipline. You utilize careful equipment depreciation schedules, reinvestment credits, and structured charitable vehicles to lower your liability while building a rock-solid corporate foundation. It demands transparency, precision, and a profound respect for the regulatory boundaries governing American commerce. My father possessed absolutely none of those qualities. I placed the official filings submitted to the federal government on my left monitor. On the right monitor, I pulled up the raw, unfiltered internal revenue ledgers I had just extracted from his administrative dashboard. I began to cross-reference the two data sets. The discrepancy did not just raise a red flag, it set the entire screen on fire. Richard was not utilizing legal financial optimization. He was committing brazen, catastrophic federal tax evasion. He had systematically underreported the incoming freight revenue by hundreds of thousands of dollars over a rolling 3-year period. The mechanics of his theft were surprisingly crude. He routed the most profitable regional shipping contracts through secondary, unregistered dummy accounts, effectively hiding the actual corporate cash flow from the government auditors. Simultaneously, he grossly inflated the operational expenses on the official returns. He claimed massive illegal deductions for the phantom salaries paid to Todd and Brittany, categorizing their luxury resort vacations and country club membership dues as essential business operations. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, driving the breath from my lungs. I pushed my chair away from the glass desk and stared at the glowing digits. The $250,000 he begged for on my frozen porch was never going to save the logistics firm. It was never going to appease his silent partner. The federal algorithms utilized by the Internal Revenue Service had undoubtedly already flagged these massive, reckless inconsistencies. A full-scale governmental audit was not a distant possibility. It was an impending, unavoidable certainty. If I had caved to his midnight manipulation, the consequences would have destroyed my future. If I had written that check, if I had wired my hard-earned life savings into his operating account, the federal government would have frozen the assets the moment the audit commenced. The authorities would have seized my clean capital to satisfy his outstanding tax penalties and criminal fines. Richard was not merely asking for a familial financial lifeline. He was trying to drag me into a federal black hole. He wanted to use my pristine money as a temporary meat shield against his own impending criminal liability. I needed definitive proof that he knew the audit was already coming. Fraud of this magnitude rarely stays quiet within an accounting department. I exited the primary accounting software and accessed the corporate email server exchange. Using the master administrative privileges he foolishly provided, I navigated to the archived communications belonging to his former chief financial officer. The CFO was a meticulous, quiet man who had abruptly resigned 8 months prior, citing vague personal reasons. I bypassed the standard inbox and ran a deep recovery protocol on the permanently deleted folder cache. The server processed the request, the progress bar inching forward across my screen. A compressed digital file finally populated. I extracted the contents and found a chain of urgent, highly classified messages dated exactly 3 days before the CFO departed the company. The final email was explicit, lacking any professional pleasantries. The accountant detailed the exact nature of the revenue discrepancies, specifically highlighting the offshore transfers and the phantom payroll allocated to Todd and Brittany. The CFO explicitly warned Richard that the federal authorities were preparing a comprehensive field audit based on the previous year anomalies. The accountant formally refused to sign the upcoming tax returns and tendered an immediate resignation to avoid criminal implication, concluding the email with a strict legal warning to retain independent defense counsel. Richard had read that warning. He had manually deleted it from the server, attempting to erase history. He knew his empire was days away from federal seizure. He knew the venture capitalist would eventually discover the rot. Yet he still drove to my house, tracked freezing mud onto the rug my wife purchased, and tried to guilt me into throwing my entire life into his blazing fire. The last lingering trace of the hurt sun vanished from my chest, replaced entirely by the cold, calculating mind of a liability expert. I was holding absolute, undeniable proof of his financial ruin. The sudden vibration of my cell phone broke the intense silence of my office. The caller identification displayed Richard's number. The sun was fully up now, casting bright morning light across my desk and illuminating the printed evidence. I took a slow breath, centering my focus, and accepted the call. "Do you have the money ready?" Richard demanded. The frantic, shivering desperation from midnight had completely evaporated. It was replaced by a harsh, entitled aggression. It was the demanding tone of a man entirely accustomed to bullying his way out of consequences. "I am reviewing the ledgers now," I replied, my voice projecting total, detached calm. "There is nothing to review," he snapped, his breathing heavy and erratic through the speaker. "I told you what I need. I need the capital wired by Friday morning to meet payroll and satisfy the partner. Stop playing amateur auditor and do what you are supposed to do. You owe this family." I leaned back in the leather chair, staring at the recovered email from his accountant. I do not write blind checks, Richard. The numbers have to make sense. His temper flared, the thin veneer of parental authority cracking completely. Do not test me, Jonah. I have spent 30 years building a pristine reputation in Wichita. If you let this company fold, I will make sure every country club member, every board director, and every socialite in this city knows exactly what kind of selfish, ungrateful child you are. I will ruin your consulting business. Nobody will hire a man who left his own father to rot in the street. He was attempting to use high society extortion to mask his suffocating panic. He wanted to smear my name across town, entirely oblivious to the fact that his name was about to become the subject of a federal indictment. I let his threats echo in the quiet office, savoring the absolute lack of fear in my chest. He possessed zero leverage. I held every single card in the deck. Friday afternoon, I said, ignoring his tantrum entirely. What he barked, thrown off balance by my lack of submission. I will not do a wire transfer, I explained, keeping my cadence smooth, professional, and transactional. We will do this properly. I will bring the finalized paperwork and a certified cashier check. Meet me at your private country club, 2 o'clock sharp. Have Helen, Todd, and Brittany there as well. If I am injecting this much capital into the family ecosystem, I want everyone present to understand the new financial structure. Richard exhaled a heavy, ragged sigh of relief, completely mistaking my strategy for capitulation. He thought his intimidation tactic had succeeded. Finally, he muttered, 2 o'clock. Do not be late. He terminated the call. I set the phone down next to the encrypted drive. I had the forgery evidence, the ghost payroll files, and the tax evasion proof securely locked away. The trap was set, perfectly tailored to his arrogance. Now, I just needed to invite the executioner. I pulled up a new search window and began typing the name of his silent venture capitalist partner. The search bar on my second monitor blinked, waiting for an input. I needed to identify the exact venture capital entity backing my father's logistics firm. I opened the original funding articles embedded deep within the corporate network and located the primary holding company. It was listed under the name Prairie Capital Management. I ran a quick background query through the State Registry of Corporate Entities, pulling the public disclosure forms to find the registered managing director. The state website loaded. The principal trustee listed at the top of the digital document was Marcus Sterling. The name hit me with the force of a physical collision. My lungs tightened. The detached clinical focus I had maintained all morning fractured. Sarah had mentioned Marcus Sterling dozens of times over the dinner table. He was the senior managing partner at the exact wealth management firm where she worked. He was the man who controlled her promotion track, her annual bonuses, and her professional reputation within the highly competitive Wichita financial sector. The scope of the danger expanded instantly. This was no longer just an isolated case of family fraud. This was a direct, catastrophic threat to my wife. If the federal authorities executed an audit on the logistics company and discovered Richard was embezzling venture capital funds managed by Marcus Sterling, the fallout would not stay contained to my father's office. The investigation would inevitably sweep through Sarah's workplace. The federal regulators would rip through Prairie Capital Management. Her colleagues would connect the dots. The pristine professional reputation she had spent a decade building would become collateral damage in her father-in-law's criminal collapse. Helen showing up in the lobby to pitch a public tantrum was just a minor inconvenience compared to this. If I allowed Richard to drag this out, Sarah would be professionally ruined. I needed to sever the connection immediately. I needed to commit corporate treason against my own blood to protect my future. I utilized my consulting firm credentials to bypass the standard reception desk at Prairie Capital Management, securing the direct private office line for Marcus Sterling. I dialed the number. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp, hurried, and impatient. I introduced myself as Richard Ralphie's son and an independent corporate restructuring consultant. I kept my tone perfectly level, stripping away any familial emotion. I informed him that I had uncovered critical financial irregularities within the logistics company ledgers. irregularities that posed an immediate existential threat to his capital investment. I requested a discreet, off-the-books meeting before the end of the week. Marcus was a seasoned investor. He recognized the specific gravity in my voice. Wealthy men do not ignore warnings about their money. He canceled his Thursday morning appointments and agreed to meet me. I chose the location carefully. It was an old, weathered diner on the rural outskirts of the city, sitting adjacent to a rusted grain silo. It was miles away from the manicured country clubs and high society steakhouses where men like Richard and Marcus usually conducted their business. Thursday morning arrived with a bitter frost. The diner smelled of stale grease, burnt toast, and industrial floor cleaner. I sat in a corner booth. The red vinyl seat was cracked, mended with overlapping strips of gray duct tape. The bell above the entrance chimed. Marcus Sterling walked through the door. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and a luxury silver watch, looking profoundly out of place under the buzzing, flickering fluorescent lights. He scanned the room, spotted me sitting alone in the corner, and walked over. He slid into the booth opposite me, his posture rigid and guarded. A tired waitress wearing a stained apron approached the table. She dropped 2 heavy, chipped ceramic mugs on the sticky formica surface and filled them with cheap, lukewarm coffee from a glass carafe. She walked away without saying a word. The contrast was staggering. We were sitting in a forgotten roadside diner, drinking watered-down coffee, preparing to discuss millions of dollars in stolen capital and severe federal felonies. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder I had compiled overnight. I slid it across the sticky table. Marcus looked at the folder, then at me, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He opened the cover. I walked him through the data with surgical precision. I showed him the ghost payroll profiles belonging to Todd and Brittany. I pointed out the date stamps on the Cabo San Lucas vacation reimbursements, highlighting Richard's administrative approval signatures. I flipped to the offshore wire transfer logs, demonstrating exactly how the operating capital was being drained into untraceable shell accounts. Finally, I presented the undeniable proof of the tax evasion, exposing the deliberate underreporting of regional freight revenue. The arrogant, guarded posture of the wealthy investor vanished. Marcus stiffened, his face flushed with pure, unadulterated rage. He realized he had been played for a fool by a regional logistics manager he thought he controlled. His breathing turned ragged. He slammed his hand against the formica table, causing the cheap coffee mugs to rattle. He reached into his jacket pocket for his cell phone. "I am calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now," he hissed, his voice vibrating with fury. "I will have federal agents lock down his headquarters before noon. I will see your father rot in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life." I reached across the table and placed my hand firmly over his wrist, stopping him from dialing the number. "If you call the authorities today, you lose every single cent of your investment," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. Marcus glared at me, the anger radiating from his sharp features. "Explain yourself." I laid out the tax alpha reality. Richard has been defrauding the Internal Revenue Service for 3 years, I explained. If you trigger a federal investigation, the government will instantly freeze the corporate accounts. The authorities will place a lien on the physical assets. The freight trucks, the warehouses, the routing contracts, all of it will be locked in a grueling legal purgatory for a decade. By the time the courts untangle the mess, the logistics firm will be completely worthless. You will never recover your capital. Marcus slowly lowered his cell phone, the logic of my assessment penetrating his rage. He stared at the damning paperwork scattered across the table. What is the alternative? I released his wrist and slid a second, thinner folder across the table. It contained a comprehensive, legally sound restructuring framework, a mechanism to execute a hostile internal corporate takeover. I outlined exactly how Marcus could utilize the breach of contract clauses hidden deep within his original venture capital funding agreement. The framework provided the legal infrastructure to immediately terminate Richard from his position as chief executive officer. It detailed the exact maneuvers required to seize his corporate shares and liquidate his personal assets to recover the stolen funds, all before the government even had time to issue a subpoena. Marcus read the blueprint. He traced the legal mechanisms with his index finger, processing the sheer elegance of the corporate coup. The blinding rage in his eyes shifted, settling into a profound, calculating respect. He looked up at me. He recognized that the man sitting across from him was not a grieving son. I was a highly dangerous, incredibly effective architect. "Why are you handing me the weapon to destroy your own father?" Marcus asked, his tone dropping into a quiet, serious register. "What do you want in exchange?" I pulled out the final piece of paper from my briefcase. I set the forged commercial equipment promissory note on top of the restructuring framework. "He stole my identity," I stated coldly. "He forged my signature on a massive commercial debt to hide his losses. I want total legal indemnity. When you execute the asset seizure, you will legally absorb this specific debt and reassign the liability entirely to his remaining liquidated estate. You will clear my name permanently. Furthermore, you will ensure my wife never hears a single whisper of this scandal at your firm." Marcus looked at the forged signature, digesting the full scope of Richard's depravity. He looked back at me, the corners of his mouth turning upward into a grim, predatory smile. He extended his hand across the table, hovering over the lukewarm coffee mugs. "You have yourself a deal, Jonah." I gripped his hand, sealing the pact. The corporate treason was finalized. The timeline shifts forward. It is Friday morning, the day of the country club meeting. I stand in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom. The morning light spills across the hardwood floor. I methodically button a crisp white dress shirt. I pull a tailored dark navy suit jacket over my shoulders, adjusting the lapels until they sit perfectly flat against my chest. I tie a deep blue silk tie, pulling the knot tight against my collar. I look at my reflection. There is no fear. There is no lingering guilt regarding the family that discarded me. I feel incredibly sharp-focused and entirely bulletproof. I pick up my leather briefcase, the weight of the indictment dossier resting heavily inside the primary compartment. I walk down the stairs, kiss Sarah goodbye, and head out to the driveway. I slide into the driver's seat of my car, turn the key in the ignition, and head toward the manicured lawns of the Wichita Country Club. The trap is fully spring-loaded. I am ready to let it snap. The drive across Wichita offered a stark visual transition between the gritty reality of the morning and the pristine illusion of the afternoon. I left the rusted grain silos and the sticky formica tables of the roadside diner far behind, navigating my sedan into the affluent, gated perimeter of the local country club. The tires crunched softly against a driveway paved entirely with crushed white gravel. The sprawling clubhouse loomed ahead, a fortress constructed from imported limestone and dark cedar, designed specifically to keep the harsh consequences of the real world at bay. It was a sanctuary for the elite, a place where wealthy men retreated to ignore their failures. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed across the circular drive, opening doors for members stepping out of European sports cars. I parked my own vehicle, retrieved my leather briefcase from the passenger seat, and gripped the handle tight. Walking up the wide stone steps, I felt the familiar, heavy atmosphere of old money and manufactured prestige settle over my shoulders. For decades, Richard had utilized this exact environment to project invulnerability. He brought skeptical clients here to impress them. He brought business rivals here to intimidate them. Today, he intended to use the opulent architecture to bully his estranged son into financial submission. I bypassed the crowded main dining hall, nodding briefly to the host who guided me down a quiet, carpeted VIP corridor. He stopped in front of a set of heavy oak double doors, grasping the brass handles and pulling them open. The private dining suite smelled of expensive roasted garlic, polished wood, and subtle cologne. Sitting around a massive mahogany table were the four architects of my misery. Richard anchored the head of the table. He wore a freshly pressed charcoal suit, his posture rigid and authoritative. The frantic, shivering desperation he displayed on my frozen porch was entirely gone, replaced by the false confidence of a returning monarch. Helen sat to his right, adorned in a silk blouse and a glittering diamond tennis bracelet. Brittany and Todd occupied the adjacent seats along the flank. Todd leaned back in his chair, adjusting the stiff cuffs of his tailored shirt, projecting the image of a highly successful real estate tycoon, despite his secret impending foreclosure. Brittany offered a tight, artificial smile, her hands resting protectively over her designer maternity dress. They looked like a corporate magazine spread showcasing the pinnacle of American prosperity. It was a brilliant, hollow facade, and I held the pin, ready to burst it. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, sealing us inside the private suite. The suffocating pressure of my family dynamics saturated the room instantly. For 32 years, this specific group configuration had been utilized to outvote, belittle, and marginalize every independent decision I ever made. They expected the standard routine to proceed flawlessly. They anticipated a brief lecture regarding loyalty, a few manufactured tears, and my ultimate surrender of $250,000. Richard gestured toward the lone, empty leather chair at the opposite end of the mahogany expanse, assigning me my designated place. I walked over and sat down, placing my briefcase directly onto the polished wood surface. I did not return Brittany's fake smile. I did not acknowledge Todd's arrogant nod. I simply folded my hands and waited. Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his silver tie clip. He signaled the sommelier hovering discreetly near the corner shadows of the room. "We will take the Reserve Cabernet Richard instructed," his voice booming with artificial authority, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "The 1998 vintage." The sommelier bowed his head slightly, retrieving a dusty bottle from a temperature-controlled cabinet. I recognized the label. It retailed for nearly $300. The dramatic irony of the moment tasted sweeter than any fermented grape juice. Richard was actively celebrating a victory he believed was already secured. He was casually charging hundreds of dollars to a corporate account, while his logistics empire secretly faced imminent federal seizure. He genuinely thought he had outsmarted the government auditors. He firmly believed he had successfully manipulated his discarded son. He had no idea the executioner had already signed the warrant. As the sommelier poured the crimson liquid into wide crystal glasses, Helen initiated the psychological assault. She leaned forward, her expression shifting seamlessly into a mask of deep maternal concern. "Jonah," she began, her tone dripping with saccharine condescension, "I know the past few months have been strained. We are sorry we could not attend your botanical garden ceremony. Things were just so chaotic with the business logistics and the new baby arriving soon. But you have to understand, family has to stick together during hard times. Blood is thicker than temporary disagreements. We need to put the past behind us and focus on saving your father's legacy." It was a masterpiece of toxic manipulation. She delivered a backhanded non-apology, deliberately minimizing my wedding to a mere temporary disagreement, while simultaneously placing the entire burden of their survival squarely onto my shoulders. She wanted me to feel guilty for holding a grudge while they were supposedly suffering. I did not respond. I let her hollow words hang in the air, allowing the silence to stretch until it became physically uncomfortable. I watched Brittany shift nervously in her seat, her eyes darting between my stoic face and the leather briefcase resting under my hands. Todd let out a loud, theatrical sigh, shattering the quiet tension. He lifted his left wrist, tapping the crystal face of his heavy platinum chronometer. "Come on, bro," Todd muttered, shaking his head with exaggerated exhaustion. "We have major real estate meetings to get to this afternoon. Let us skip the dramatic pauses. You brought the cashier check, right? Just sign the paper and hand it over so we can all get back to business." His impatience was almost comical. The man who had not closed a legitimate property deal in 2 years was pretending to be late for a high-stakes negotiation. He was trying to bully me, using false bravado to mask the creeping terror of his own financial ruin. He wanted to rush the transaction before anyone asked too many questions. Richard picked up his wine glass, swirling the dark liquid, watching the crimson legs run down the crystal edge. "The bank closes at 5, he added, his voice hardening, dropping the charade of fatherly warmth. "We need to execute the wire transfer immediately to satisfy the venture capital audit tomorrow morning." Open the briefcase, Jonah. Give me the funds. I absorbed their combined arrogance. I analyzed Helen's fake sympathy, Todd's hollow bravado, Brittany's expectant greed, and Richard's blinding ego. They were sitting in a burning house, demanding I hand them a bucket of cash instead of pointing out the flames. I mirrored the exact silence from the opening phone call 6 months prior. I remained perfectly calm, calculating, and cold. I reached forward and unlatched the brass locks on my briefcase. The metal clasps clicked sharply, the mechanical sound echoing across the long mahogany table. I opened the leather lid. I did not pull out a certified bank check. I did not retrieve a wire transfer authorization form. Instead, I reached inside and grasped the thick, legally bound dossier. It contained the offshore wire logs, the ghost payroll evidence, the federal tax evasion proof, and the forged commercial promissory note. I lifted the heavy stack of paper and set it onto the table. The crisp, white edges contrasted sharply against the dark wood. I kept my eyes locked directly onto Richard's face as I pressed my palm flat against the documents and pushed. The dossier slid smoothly across the polished mahogany, the paper whispering against the varnish, coming to a halt right next to his $300 glass of wine. The thick portfolio stopped sliding, coming to a halt directly beside the crystal goblet of imported reserve wine. Richard stared at the blank cardstock cover, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He had anticipated a certified bank draft, a simple rectangular slip of financial salvation. Instead, he faced a bound compilation of raw data. He reached out with manicured fingers and flipped the heavy cover open. The first page displayed the Internal Revenue Reconciliation disparity. I watched the exact second the oxygen vacated his lungs. The manufactured authority evaporated from his posture like mist burning off hot pavement. His rigid shoulders slumped forward. The healthy, confident flush in his cheeks drained away, leaving his skin a pale, sickly shade of gray. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his breathing accelerating into shallow, ragged gasps. The expensive crimson liquid in his glass sat entirely ignored, its surface rippling slightly from the sudden tremor vibrating through his hands. "What is this?" Helen asked, her saccharine tone faltering into genuine uncertainty. She leaned closer, her eyes squinting, as she tried to decipher the dense spreadsheets and highlighted ledgers. "That is an autopsy," I stated, my voice echoing flat and cold across the quiet dining suite. "It is a detailed chronological dissection of your impending ruin." Todd scoffed, shifting uncomfortably against the plush leather backing of his chair. He attempted to project his usual real estate tycoon bravado, puffing his chest outward. "Cut the dramatic nonsense, bro. Just hand over the bailout funds. We do not have the patience to review your boring consulting reports." I turned my gaze toward my brother-in-law. "The time for blind funding ended at midnight, Todd. I suggest you turn to page 14. Richard remained frozen, paralyzed by the offshore wire transfer logs staring back at him. I reached across the expanse of polished wood, grasped the corner of the portfolio, and turned the pages myself. I smoothed the federal W-2 tax forms flat against the table. "You and Brittany are listed as senior logistics consultants," I noted, tracing my index finger beneath their printed names. "You are drawing a combined compensation of $180,000 annually from a venture capital-funded enterprise." Todd adjusted his tailored collar, a nervous tick betraying his false courage. "We provide vital advisory services to the executive board." "You provide nothing," I countered, keeping my cadence clinical and detached. I pulled the Cabo San Lucas expense receipts from the stack, setting them adjacent to the payroll files. "You file fraudulent travel reimbursements for tropical vacations, classifying beachside jet ski rentals as client retention operations. You have never stepped foot inside the corporate headquarters." Todd slammed his palm onto the armrest, attempting physical intimidation. "Listen to me, you little pencil pusher. You do not get to walk into this private club and interrogate us." I did not flinch. "Defrauding a federally backed investment firm using phantom employees is a felony," I informed him, my tone lowering into a dangerous, precise whisper. The Internal Revenue Code defines ghost payroll as grand larceny and wire fraud. When the government auditors arrive, they will not care about your advisory excuses. They will freeze your bank accounts, strip your real estate license, and send you both to a federal penitentiary.
The artificial bravado drained from Todd's face in an instant. He sank back into his seat, his jaw hanging slack, his eyes wide with sudden comprehension. Beside him, Brittany let out a sharp, trembling gasp. The reality of her situation pierced her entitled bubble. The mortgage, she whimpered, her hands gripping the edges of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Her panicked gaze darted toward Richard. "Dad, you said you had the mortgage covered. You promised the house was safe." Richard remained mute, his eyes glued to the financial wreckage spread before him. "The residential safety net is gone, Brittany," I explained, delivering the truth without a single shred of pity. "The corporate operating accounts are empty. The bank will foreclose on your luxury property before your new baby even arrives." Tears spilled over her cheeks, ruining her pristine makeup. She buried her face in her hands, her jagged, wet sobs filling the silent room. Helen panicked. She could not comprehend the sudden, violent collapse of her perfect social image. She reached forward, her diamond tennis bracelet clinking loudly against the wood. She splayed her manicured hands flat over the printed evidence, a pathetic, childish gesture, as if shielding the paper from view could magically erase the devastating truth underneath. "Jonah, stop this right now," Helen demanded, her voice shrill and vibrating with denial. "You are upsetting your sister. This is all a misunderstanding. Your father is a respected businessman. We can fix whatever minor accounting errors you found. Just write the check and stop being cruel." I ignored her jeweled hands. I opened my briefcase a second time and retrieved a separate single manila envelope. I bypassed Helen entirely and slid the envelope directly in front of Richard. "Minor accounting errors do not result in Chicago debt collectors skip tracing my marital address," I said. Richard flinched. He knew exactly what resided inside that specific envelope. He refused to open it. I unfastened the metal clasp and extracted the commercial equipment promissory note. I laid the document directly on top of Helen's desperate, trembling fingers. "You needed $250,000 to appease the auditors," I recounted, dissecting his midnight lie piece by piece. "But that was merely a temporary patch. The true anchor dragging your empire down is this forged loan. You stole my Social Security number, registered a shell corporation at a Topeka strip mall, and intercepted the defaulted billing statements for 3 years. The private suite grew so quiet, I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway corridor." "Look at the signature," I instructed. Richard kept his eyes squeezed shut, refusing to acknowledge the paper. I tapped the heavy, rightward-leaning ink. The loops on the vowels were compressed. The final letter terminated in a sharp, slanted slash. "For 18 years, you handed me cheap birthday cards containing $20 bills. You signed every single one of them using this exact, distinctive penmanship. I still remember the card from my 12th birthday, where you ordered me to mow the lawn. You did not even bother to alter your handwriting when you committed federal identity theft against your own son." He swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing a slow path down his pale temple. To eliminate any remaining doubt, I placed the digital server logs next to the forgery. The metadata IP addresses confirm the loan application was transmitted directly from the primary terminal inside your corner office. The digital footprint places you directly at the scene of the crime. Richard finally opened his eyes. He looked broken, entirely stripped of the flawless authority he had wielded my entire life. He parted his dry, cracked lips, his voice emerging as a raspy, defeated whisper. "How much do you want?" He still thought this was a negotiation. He assumed I compiled this prosecution to extort him, to demand a massive payout in exchange for my silence. "I do not want your money, Richard." "Then why did you bring this here?" he pleaded, his hands shaking as he gestured toward the scattered evidence. "What is the price to make this disappear?" "There is no price," I replied, standing up from my leather chair and buttoning my suit jacket. "Because it is already too late. I did not assemble this portfolio for you.
I compiled it for your silent partner." The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him the shade of old parchment. "I met with Marcus Sterling yesterday morning at a rural diner outside the city limits," I revealed, dropping the final, devastating bomb onto the mahogany surface. Helen gasped, pulling her hands away from the documents as if the paper had suddenly caught fire. Todd stared at me, his eyes wide with unadulterated horror. "I handed Marcus every single page you see on this table," I continued, my voice echoing with terminal finality. "I explained the offshore wire transfers. I demonstrated the tax evasion. I proved the ghost payroll fraud." He was furious, Richard. He realized you were draining his venture capital investment to fund tropical vacations and luxury mortgages. Richard gripped the edge of the table, trying to anchor himself as his universe collapsed around him. He wanted to call the federal authorities immediately, I noted, but I convinced him to choose a more lucrative path. I provided Marcus with a comprehensive corporate restructuring framework. We utilized the breach of contract clauses hidden deep within your original funding agreement. "What did you do?" Richard choked out, his chest heaving with panic. "I handed him the legal mechanism to execute a hostile internal takeover," I answered, relishing the flawless execution of the trap. "The legal proceedings commenced yesterday afternoon. Marcus is currently terminating your position as Chief Executive Officer. His attorneys are seizing your corporate shares and liquidating your personal assets to recover his stolen funds." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the weight of inescapable consequences. In exchange for the hostile takeover blueprint Marcus provided me, with total legal indemnity, I finished looking down at the four of them. He is absorbing the forged commercial loan and transferring the liability entirely to your ruined estate. My name is clear, my wife is protected, your empire is gone. The family sat frozen around the opulent table. The suffocating arrogance they had carried into the room was eradicated, replaced by the crushing weight of their new reality. They were paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their destruction, engineered flawlessly by the son they threw away. The silence inside the private dining suite became a living, breathing entity. It settled over the mahogany table, thick and suffocating, pressing down on the four people who had walked into this room believing they owned the world. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic, hollow ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner, shadows. My gaze drifted to the crystal goblet resting near my father's right hand. The expensive reserve vintage wine poured just minutes ago in premature celebration sat entirely untouched. The crimson liquid caught the soft overhead lighting, reflecting a deep, vibrant ruby hue. It was breathing, aerating in the glass, while the man who ordered it could barely draw oxygen into his own lungs. Richard stared at the dossier. The realization of his terminal vulnerability washed over him in real time. The hostile corporate takeover was not a threat looming in the distant future. It was a mechanical, legal reality that had already been executed. The invisible gears were currently grinding his empire into dust. He looked up at me. The arrogant, commanding patriarch vanished. In his place sat an aging, terrified fraud. Jonah Richard whispered, his voice cracking, stripped of its resonant baritone. "You cannot do this. We can stop Marcus. We can call him right now and negotiate a withdrawal. I will pay you whatever percentage you want. I will make you a full partner in the firm. We can rewrite the ownership equity today." I listened to his frantic bargaining, fascinated by his inability to grasp the concept of an unchangeable outcome. He was attempting to buy his way out of an execution that had already taken place. "There is no firm left to offer me," I replied, my tone devoid of malice or triumph, delivering only cold facts. "Marcus controls the board. The lock on your corner office has already been changed." Richard leaned forward, bracing his elbows on the table, his pristine charcoal suit jacket bunched awkwardly around his shoulders. He abandoned the financial angles and grabbed for the one lever he had utilized my entire life. "You are my son," he pleaded, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "I am your father. You do not hand your own flesh and blood over to a corporate shark. You do not destroy your own family. We can fix this together. You owe me that much loyalty." I looked at the man who had forged my signature to save his own skin. I looked at the mother who had ambushed my wife in a corporate lobby. I looked at the sister who demanded I drain my savings to fund her luxury real estate, and the brother-in-law who mocked me from a Mexican beach using stolen funds. "Loyalty," I repeated, testing the weight of the word on my tongue. It felt entirely foreign in this room. Helen reached out, tears streaming through her expensive foundation, ruining her flawless makeup. "Jonah, please," she begged, her voice trembling with genuine despair. "He is right. We are your family. We made mistakes, but you cannot just abandon us." I leaned back in my leather chair. 6 months ago, I sat in my kitchen, looking at a seating chart. I had a silver pen in my hand. I listened to you pop a bottle of champagne over the phone while you casually informed me you were skipping my wedding. You told me Brittany's nursery reveal was the priority. You told me I would have other milestones. Helen recoiled her jeweled hand, pulling back toward her chest as if she had been physically struck. I stood at the altar in a botanical garden. I continued, my voice steady, projecting across the silent suite. I looked at the front row. I looked at the empty white folding chairs. My bride walked down the aisle, knowing her new in-laws viewed her husband as a disposable afterthought. You abandoned me on the most important day of my life because it was convenient for you. You chose to prioritize a party funded by embezzled corporate cash over your own son. Richard opened his mouth to formulate an excuse, but I raised my hand, cutting him off instantly. "Do not dare invoke the concept of family loyalty today," I instructed. "You traded your flesh and blood for a forged commercial loan 3 years ago. The psychological reversal is now permanent. You are the one sitting in the empty chair, Richard, and no one is coming to save you." Todd sat frozen in his seat, the reality of his impending poverty finally penetrating his thick skull. He stared at his platinum chronometer, the same watch he had tapped so arrogantly just 15 minutes prior. The timepiece was purchased with phantom payroll funds. It would soon be liquidated by federal bankruptcy attorneys. "What are we supposed to do?" Brittany sobbed, her hands clutching her designer maternity dress. Her artificial, entitled world had evaporated, leaving her terrified of the harsh financial reality waiting outside the country club gates. "I have a baby coming. We have no income." I suggest Todd updates his resume. I answered, offering zero comfort. The regional warehouses are always hiring entry-level freight loaders. It pays minimum wage, but it is honest labor. You might find the experience enlightening. Todd flinched, his jaw tightening in humiliated rage, but he lacked the courage to say a single word in return. He knew I held the power to forward the tax evasion documents directly to the Internal Revenue Service, upgrading his civil ruin to a criminal indictment. He remained trapped in a suffocating, cowardly silence. There was no theatrical groveling left. There were no more threats to hurl or bargains to strike. The room descended into the harsh, realistic quiet of a reputation being logically and legally destroyed. The opulent mahogany table, the imported reserve wine, and the tailored suits served only as a hollow backdrop to their total devastation. I stood up. I reached down and grasped the hem of my navy suit jacket, buttoning the center clasp with deliberate precision. I picked up my leather briefcase, the latches snapping shut with a sharp, metallic echo. "Marcus Sterling has retained a premier corporate litigation firm," I announced, looking down at the broken patriarch. "His attorneys will contact you by Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp. They will arrive with the asset seizure documentation and the formal termination notices. I recommend you spend the weekend locating a very skilled, very expensive defense lawyer." Richard stared blankly at the mahogany grain, his spirit entirely crushed. He did not possess the strength to lift his head. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. My fingers brushed against a heavy, cold piece of metal. I had carried this specific item with me for exactly 6 months, waiting for the precise moment to return it. I pulled out the solid brass custom name card. It was the exact place setting Richard had ordered for the wedding reception. The one that had blown off the empty family table and landed face down in the dark topsoil of the botanical garden. The brass surface was still scratched and slightly tarnished from the dirt, a perfect physical representation of his current legacy. "A man's name is his brand," I recited, echoing the exact arrogant lecture he had delivered to me months ago. I tossed the heavy piece of metal onto the table. It landed with a loud, authoritative thud, coming to rest precisely on top of the indictment dossier. The engraved letters of his name gleamed under the overhead chandelier, resting directly above the evidence of his ruin. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on the four of them, walked across the plush carpet, and pushed the heavy oak double doors open. I stepped out of the private dining suite and walked down the VIP corridor. The heavy doors swung shut behind me, sealing my past inside that opulent tomb. As I navigated through the main dining hall, the ambient noise of the country club washed over me. Wealthy patrons laughed over expensive lunches, waiters carried trays of crystal glasses, and a piano player tapped out a light jazz melody in the corner. Everyone was entirely oblivious to the financial execution that had just occurred mere feet away. I pushed through the glass exit doors and stepped out into the crisp Kansas air. The transition was profound. The suffocating pressure I had carried in my chest for the past 32 years vanished. The toxic obligation, the constant pursuit of approval, and the heavy burden of their endless manipulation evaporated into the wind. I felt lighter. I felt a deep structural peace settling into my bones. I walked across the crushed white gravel of the driveway, the sound grounding me in the present moment. I reached my sedan, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed Sarah's number. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with anticipation. "Jonah, are you okay?" I started the engine, listening to the steady, reliable hum of the motor. I looked back at the limestone facade of the country club one final time. "It is done," I told my wife, shifting the car into drive. The trap snapped shut. They know everything. Sarah let out a long, shuddering exhale, releasing her own accumulated tension. What happens now? I steered the vehicle toward the exit gates, merging onto the open suburban road. "Now," I replied. We let the weekend pass, and on Monday morning, we watched the bill come due. 90 days passed since the heavy oak doors of the country club clicked shut behind me. The harsh Kansas summer yielded to a crisp golden autumn. The frantic, suffocating chaos defining my entire childhood was replaced by a profound, enduring stillness. I sat in my home office, watching the amber morning light stretch across the hardwood floor. There were no midnight ambushes on my porch. There were no frantic phone calls demanding impossible sums of money. The silence in my house felt earned. I held a crisp, watermarked document sent via certified mail from a federal judge. The paper was thick, woven cotton bearing the official seal of the district court. It was a formal decree of nullification. Marcus Sterling had kept his word. The highly skilled litigation team at Prairie Capital Management surgically extracted my stolen identity from the freight firm debt profile. The commercial equipment promissory note was officially severed from my Social Security number. The federal court reassigned the entire principal balance, along with all accrued penalty interest, directly onto the liquidated estate of Richard Ralphie. I traced my thumb over the embossed seal at the bottom of the page. The Chicago Collection Agency was legally barred from ever contacting me again. My financial slate was wiped pristine. The dark storm cloud threatening to drown my new marriage evaporated, leaving behind a clear, brilliant horizon. I set the court decree down and picked up the latest edition of the Wichita Corporate Observer. The glossy magazine smelled of fresh ink. The cover featured a bold headline detailing the rapid restructuring of the regional shipping industry. I flipped to page 12. A 3-column spread outlined the recent dramatic overhaul at Prairie Capital Management. The pages were slick under my fingertips. The layout designer had chosen a triumphant, upward-trending graph to accompany the text. Marcus had not wasted a single second. The journalist praised the swift installation of a modernized executive board, the optimization of the shipping routes, and the projected surge in quarterly profit margins. I read the article twice, savoring the precise journalistic language. I scanned every paragraph, every quote, and every footnote. The author detailed the founding of the enterprise, the recent acquisition of new fleet vehicles, and the strategic vision of the new leadership team. Richard Ralphie was never mentioned. His name was entirely omitted from the historical record. 20 years of grueling, arrogant empire building were erased with a few keystrokes. For a severe narcissist who worshipped his own brand, who ordered solid brass place settings just to stroke his own ego, being publicly ignored was a fate far worse than financial ruin. The Wichita business community moved on, treating his tenure like a forgotten clerical error. His legacy was reduced to dust, swept away by the wind, much like the custom name card left abandoned in the botanical garden dirt. The financial contagion spread rapidly beyond my father's corner office. Without the phantom $90,000 salaries propping up their manufactured wealth, Todd and Brittany faced immediate fiscal starvation. The bank foreclosed on their sprawling suburban estate mere weeks after their child was born. The luxury vehicles were repossessed under the cover of darkness. But the true poetry of their downfall arrived courtesy of the Internal Revenue Service. Once Marcus exposed the ghost payroll scheme, the federal tax algorithms flagged my sister and brother-in-law for severe evasion. They had claimed luxury tropical vacations, designer wardrobes, and phantom income on their joint returns for half a decade. Ignorance of the law is never a valid defense against government auditors. The regulators levied crushing financial penalties against them, mandating immediate restitution and garnishing any future wages they might earn. Todd lost his real estate license pending an ethics review, rendering his empty bragging entirely obsolete. Desperation forces pride into submission. Last week, a former contact working in the shipping dispatch center sent me a text message. It contained a high-resolution photograph taken from the second-floor observation deck of the primary warehouse. I zoomed in on the image. Todd wore a bright yellow safety vest over a stained, faded, hooded sweatshirt. His posture was hunched, his former country club physique struggling under the physical demand of industrial labor. He was gripping the handles of a heavy manual pallet jack, his face glistening with sweat as he strained to move a stack of industrial cargo across the concrete loading dock. Brittany stood a few yards away, wearing steel-toed work boots and holding a battered clipboard, checking inventory codes in the freezing draft of the open loading bay. Her pristine manicures were a thing of the past, replaced by thick canvas work gloves tucked into her back pocket. They were forced to take entry-level hourly labor positions at the exact same company they used to systematically defraud. The new corporate management team, aware of their immense restitution debts, offered them the lowest-tier warehouse jobs available. They were now sweating on the concrete floor, loading the very trucks they once pretended to manage, working grueling double shifts just to keep infant formula in their rented pantry. The Golden Children were finally learning the brutal, unfiltered reality of earning an honest dollar. The quiet peace of my morning was briefly interrupted by a blinking red light on my desk phone. A blocked number bypassed my primary digital filters and deposited a voice message. I pressed the speaker button, leaning back in my leather chair. Helen's voice filled the room. She sounded frail. Her signature, breezy, condescending tone was gone, replaced by a raspy, exhausted whisper. The background noise on the recording featured the loud, relentless roar of semi-trucks driving past her new highway-adjacent apartment, a stark departure from the quiet, gated sanctuary she previously enjoyed. "Jonah, it is your mother. We had to move into a tiny rented apartment near the interstate highway. Your father is facing a grueling civil trial. Todd and Brittany are struggling to survive. I hope you are proud of yourself. You broke this family apart over a petty grudge. You destroyed us. If you have any heart left, you will call us back and help fix this mess." I reached forward and pressed the delete button. The automated system erased the recording, instantly wiping her desperate manipulation from my servers. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt, pity, or regret. Her tearful accusation provided the ultimate, undeniable validation of my departure. Even after losing their mansion, their firm, their luxury vehicles, and their social standing, they still refused to look in a mirror. They still viewed themselves as innocent victims of my supposed cruelty. They demanded accountability from everyone in the world except themselves. If I had written that bailout check, I would still be trapped inside their toxic cycle, bleeding my own resources dry to sustain their delusions.
True forensic retribution does not require shouting matches, dramatic confrontations, or theatrical cruelty. You do not need to raise your voice when the mathematics speak for themselves. I had simply organized their own financial data and handed it to the people they were stealing from. The documents performed the heavy lifting. The ledgers executed the judgment. The raw, unfiltered truth operated as an autonomous weapon, dismantling their fake reality piece by piece until nothing remained but the consequences of their own actions. The lingering shadow of my former family dissolved entirely as the Kansas winter yielded to a vibrant spring. Removing their toxic anchor from my daily existence produced an immediate psychological dividend. For 3 decades, I operated under a baseline level of dread, perpetually waiting for the next crisis, the next demand, the next unearned insult. When you exist inside a dysfunctional ecosystem for that long, the chaos begins to feel normal. You mistake the constant adrenaline spikes for genuine engagement. But once the cord was severed, the deafening noise stopped. A profound, enduring tranquility settled over our household. Sarah noticed the physical changes first. The rigid tension in my jaw softened. I slept through the night without grinding my teeth. Our marriage, no longer acting as a defensive shield against parental sabotage, blossomed into a true partnership built on mutual ambition and authentic joy. Without the constant emotional taxation draining my energy, my professional capacity expanded exponentially. The $250,000 Richard had demanded on my frozen porch remained safely untouched inside my accounts. I did not throw my life savings into his fraudulent bonfire. Instead, I used those funds to lay the foundation for my own enterprise. I leased a sleek, modern commercial suite in downtown Wichita, outfitting the space with polished concrete floors, frosted glass partitions, and ergonomic furniture. I launched Ralphie Consulting Partners. My father had spent his entire career utilizing deceit to fake success. I built my firm on the bedrock of radical transparency and rigorous ethical standards. I began taking on legitimate, hardworking corporate clients who needed genuine structural optimization. I taught them the true legal principles of tax alpha. We implemented precise depreciation schedules, ethical charitable trusts, and sustainable reinvestment strategies. We lowered their liabilities by following the stringent rules set forth by the Internal Revenue Service, creating rock-solid financial architectures that could withstand any regulatory scrutiny. Word of my meticulous methods spread rapidly through the local Chamber of Commerce. Honest business owners appreciate consultants who solve problems rather than create them. Within 6 months, my client roster was full. The revenue generated by my independent firm quickly surpassed the phantom salaries my sister and brother-in-law had stolen from the logistics company. I was thriving, not through manipulation, but through competence and integrity. That professional success mirrored the personal sanctuary Sarah and I cultivated at home. We decided to reclaim our living space, erasing the final, lingering memories of the midnight ambush. The soiled cream rug where Richard tracked his freezing mud was discarded, replaced by a rich, dark hardwood finish that radiated warmth. On a crisp Saturday evening, we hosted an intimate dinner party to celebrate our new beginning. We did not invite high society executives or wealthy country club acquaintances. We curated our guest list based entirely on authentic loyalty. The dining room table was surrounded by the exact same friends who had traveled to the botanical garden on our wedding day. These were the people who had occupied the seats behind those glaring, empty chairs. They were the individuals who offered warm smiles and unwavering support, while my blood relatives popped champagne across town.
Sarah prepared a lavish meal of roasted lamb and root vegetables, the savory aroma filling the house and blending with the sound of genuine, unfiltered laughter. We poured a modest, excellent Pinot Noir. We did not need a $300 vintage bottle to prove our worth. The value of the evening was derived from the quality of the company. Sitting at the head of the table, I watched my wife laugh at a joke delivered by my college roommate. Her eyes sparkled under the warm amber glow of the pendant lights. I observed the relaxed postures, the easy banter, and the deep unspoken trust binding everyone in the room together. The contrast between this vibrant gathering and the suffocating tension of the private dining suite was staggering. Blood entitlement demands unconditional obedience while offering nothing in return. Chosen loyalty requires constant mutual investment, paying out dividends of respect and care. If you are listening to this right now and you are holding on to a toxic relationship because of history, remember that shared DNA does not equal a shared future. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep your abusers warm. Walking away is often the most courageous choice you can make. I stepped into the kitchen to retrieve another bottle of sparkling water, pausing by the island counter to reflect on the nature of betrayal. Society conditions us to view betrayal as a sudden, violent explosion, a singular, catastrophic event that destroys a relationship instantly. But my experience taught me a different truth. The betrayal inflicted by my family was not a sudden detonation. It was a slow, quiet siphoning of my self-worth. It was 1,000 tiny dismissals, a decade of conditional affection, and a lifetime of being treated as an asset rather than a human being. They drained my emotional reserves drop by drop until my wedding day finally exposed the empty reservoir. By cutting ties, I merely applied the core tenets of structural optimization to my own life. I identified the toxic liabilities dragging down my personal ledger. I executed a hard restructuring, removing the fraudulent actors from my daily operations. The result was a clean, balanced life where every emotional investment yielded a positive return. The pacing of my days slowed down, no longer dictated by the erratic demands of a narcissistic father or an entitled sister. I secured my peace through subtraction. The following Monday morning arrived with a clear, cloudless sky. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, kissed Sarah before she drove to her wealth management firm, and stepped out onto the front porch. The frozen slush of winter was a distant memory, replaced by the soft green, manicured grass of our suburban neighborhood. I walked down the concrete driveway toward the brick mailbox standing near the curb. I opened the small metal door and pulled out a stack of letters. I sorted through the routine envelopes, discarding grocery store circulars and standard utility bills. Near the bottom of the pile, a thick, formal parcel caught my attention. It was printed on heavy ivory paper. The return address did not belong to a debt collection agency, a frantic relative, or an angry venture capitalist. It originated from the United States Federal Bankruptcy Court for the District of Kansas. I slid my thumb under the sealed flap and extracted the folded legal document. I scanned the bold black text stamped across the top of the page. The words brought the entire 6-month saga full circle, closing the final loop and the trap I had set inside the country club. The consequences of the forensic hunt were no longer just theoretical. They had arrived in writing, demanding a final resolution. The Kansas morning sun warmed my shoulders as I carried the thick, ivory envelope up the concrete driveway. The suburban neighborhood remained peaceful, undisturbed, except for the distant, muffled hum of a lawnmower. I walked through the front door, the solid wood clicking shut behind me, sealing out the gentle breeze. The house smelled of fresh roasted coffee beans and faint vanilla. Sarah had already left for the wealth management firm, leaving me alone in the tranquil silence of our home. I walked into the kitchen, set the remaining stack of mundane mail onto the marble island, and held on to the official parcel from the United States Federal Bankruptcy Court. I slid my thumb under the sealed flap, tearing the heavy paper open. I extracted a thick stack of stapled documents, unfolding them flat against the cold stone counter. The bold black text across the header designated the filing as a Chapter 7 liquidation. It was the formal, terminal legal notification regarding the estate of Richard Ralphie.
The majestic logistics empire my father spent decades boasting about was officially reduced to a series of numbered asset columns waiting for the auction block. I read through the dense legal jargon, digesting the sheer scale of his ruin. The court-appointed trustee was methodically stripping his reality down to the studs. The luxury vehicles, the country club equity, the commercial real estate holdings, and the personal bank accounts were all seized, frozen, and slated for immediate liquidation. The proceeds were designated to satisfy the immense restitution demanded by the Internal Revenue Service and the venture capital firm managed by Marcus Sterling. I flipped to the third page, scanning the index of secured and unsecured liabilities. My eyes stopped on a specific paragraph near the bottom of the page. My name was printed in bold ink. Due to the previous identity theft and the subsequent reassignment of the forged commercial equipment loan, the federal court recognized me as a verified victim of financial fraud. The legal mechanisms Marcus utilized during his hostile takeover had formally registered the damages against Richard's estate. Therefore, the bankruptcy judge listed me as a priority creditor. The document requested my formal appearance at an upcoming creditor hearing in downtown Wichita. The trustee was offering me a designated percentage of whatever fractional pennies remained after the government extracted their share. I stared at the summons. The law was handing me a pristine opportunity to extract financial blood from the man who discarded me. I could hire a litigator, attend the hearings, and fight for every last dime he had stolen using my Social Security number. I could sit in the polished wooden pews of the federal courthouse, look him directly in the eyes while he sat at the defendant table, and watch the judge strip away his final remaining assets to write me a check. It was a tempting proposition. Society often conditions us to believe that justice requires visible suffering. We are taught that victory is only achieved when you stand over your defeated opponent and take whatever they have left. But I looked at the marble counter. I looked at the peaceful, sunlit kitchen I shared with a woman who loved me without condition. I listened to the serene quiet of my house. Engaging in the bankruptcy process required prolonged exposure. It meant tethering myself to his toxicity for another 12 months. It meant navigating depositions, sitting through tense mediations, and breathing the same recycled courthouse air as the people who abandoned me at the altar. If I demanded that payout, I would be allowing their dysfunction to dictate my schedule once again. I would be inviting the chaos back across my threshold. I reached for my laptop resting on the edge of the kitchen island. I opened the browser and navigated to the secure digital portal listed on the federal notification. I entered the assigned case number and my verification details. The screen loaded, presenting a dashboard of legal options regarding the liquidation proceedings. I clicked on the tab labeled Creditor Claims. A secondary menu appeared, offering a digital form to formally assert my right to the financial restitution. Right below it was a smaller, less prominent link, Waiver of Claim. I clicked the second option. A dense, multi-page legal waiver populated the screen. The text explicitly outlined that by signing the document, I permanently forfeited any right to pursue financial damages from the estate of Richard Ralphie. It warned that the decision was irrevocable, binding under federal law, and prohibited any future litigation regarding the forged commercial loan. I scrolled directly to the bottom of the form without reading the repetitive clauses. A digital signature box blinked, waiting for my input. I typed my full name into the empty field. I clicked the Submit button. The screen refreshed, displaying a bright green confirmation checkmark. The waiver was officially logged into the federal docket. I relinquished my right to the payout, choosing to walk away without demanding a single cent. I bought my permanent freedom by refusing to engage. I closed the laptop and picked up the thick stack of physical court documents. I walked down the hallway and entered my home office. The morning light filtered through the horizontal blinds, casting thin shadows across the dark hardwood floor. I approached the heavy-duty paper shredder sitting discreetly beside my glass desk. I reached down and flipped the power switch. The internal motor hummed to life, a low, steady vibration echoing in the quiet room. I aligned the bottom edge of the federal bankruptcy notification with the feeding slot. I gently pushed the ivory paper downward. The steel teeth caught the document, pulling it inward with a sharp, rhythmic grinding noise. I watched the bold black text, the official seals, and the names of my toxic family members disappear into the mechanical jaws. The auditory and visual metaphor provided a profound cellular level of psychological satisfaction. The heavy, suffocating weight of my childhood was physically transforming into thin, meaningless white ribbons. The paper collected in the clear plastic bin below a shredded mountain of severed ties. I fed the second page into the machine, then the third, until the entire legal packet was eradicated. I turned the power switch off. The motor wound down, leaving the office in pristine silence once again. I stood over the shredder, taking a deep, slow breath. I searched my conscience for any trace of lingering guilt. I waited for the familiar, nagging voice of obligation that used to keep me awake at night, wondering if I made the wrong choice, wondering if I owed them one final chance at redemption. The voice never arrived. The quiet was absolute. The forensic, emotionless nature of my investigation had provided an objective truth that could never be unlearned. I did not rely on feelings to justify my departure. I relied on the hard, undeniable data printed on the offshore wire logs and the ghost payroll W-2 forms. The mathematics insulated me from their manipulation. You cannot gaslight a ledger. You cannot guilt-trip a digital timestamp. The numbers proved their betrayal, granting me the permanent permission I needed to walk away without a single backward glance. True retribution is rarely depicted accurately. It is not about screaming matches in the rain, theatrical vengeance, or watching the other person suffer in agony. That kind of dramatic retaliation still requires a deep, burning attachment to the abuser. It means they still control your emotional baseline. True revenge is achieving total detachment. It is the realization that their existence no longer impacts your reality. It is making yourself legally, financially, and emotionally untouchable. I walked over to my glass desk and sat down in the leather chair. I looked at the framed photograph resting near my monitor. It was an image captured on my wedding day, taken shortly after the vows. Sarah and I were standing in the botanical garden, surrounded by vibrant summer flowers. We were smiling, leaning into each other, radiating a quiet, self-sufficient strength. The empty chairs were not visible in the frame. The people who refused to show up were entirely irrelevant to the joy captured in that frozen moment. I booted up my dual monitors, preparing to review a new structural optimization portfolio for a legitimate consulting client. My calendar was full. My mind was clear. The past was permanently shredded, resting at the bottom of a plastic bin, while my future stretched out in front of me, vast and unburdened. The heavy lifting was finished. The narrative of the discarded son was officially closed. All that remained was the quiet clarity of a man who had successfully engineered his own rescue. The shredder in my home office powered down, returning the room to a pristine, uninterrupted quiet. The federal bankruptcy notification was reduced to a mound of meaningless white ribbons resting at the bottom of a plastic bin. Waiving my right to a meager creditor payout might have seemed irrational to an outside observer. A standard financial advisor would argue that leaving restitution money on the table is a foolish concession. But I possessed a distinct advantage over standard advisors. I understood the granular architecture of my father's ruin, and I knew that demanding a fractional settlement check was thinking far too small. I did not want the scraps falling from the federal liquidation table. I intended to purchase the entire table. When a corporate entity enters Chapter 7 bankruptcy, the court-appointed trustee is tasked with liquidating the physical and intellectual property to satisfy outstanding debts. These commercial auctions are devoid of sentiment. They operate on strict, ruthless efficiency. The venture capital firm managed by Marcus Sterling had extracted their pound of flesh, dismantling the executive structure and exposing the remaining operational assets to the open market. This was where my specialized knowledge transformed into tangible power. 14 years prior, I sat in a dark home office at 2 a.m,
manually balancing the corporate ledgers because Richard refused to hire a bookkeeper. I mapped the shipping routes, categorized the fleet maintenance schedules, and memorized the regional distribution nodes. I knew exactly which localized delivery contracts generated reliable, high-margin profit, and which territories were bloated vanity projects designed solely to stroke my father's ego. I possessed the entire corporate blueprint encoded in my memory. 3 weeks after I shredded the creditor notification, the federal commercial auction commenced via a secure digital portal. I sat at my glass desk, sipping black coffee, watching the digital countdown clock tick across my dual monitors. I had spent the previous month establishing a clean, independent holding company structured under the umbrella of Ralphie Consulting Partners. I pooled the $250,000 I originally saved, combining it with the surging revenue generated by my new, legitimate consulting clients. I possessed significant liquid capital ready to deploy. The auction interface loaded, displaying the fractured remnants of the logistics empire. The bidding was sparse. Regional competitors were hesitant to touch an enterprise stained by federal tax evasion and corporate fraud. They viewed the assets as toxic waste. I viewed them as raw, mismanaged materials waiting for structural optimization. I bypassed the expensive, flashy executive vehicles and the bloated downtown office leases. I targeted the core machinery. I placed calculated, aggressive bids on the primary distribution warehouse located near the interstate junction. I acquired the proprietary dispatch routing software, the commercial freight fleet, and the exclusive vendor contracts for the tri-state shipping lanes. Because the market perception was tainted by scandal, the asset valuations plummeted. I executed the digital transactions, purchasing the operational heart of the business for pennies on the dollar. By noon, the auction concluded. The automated confirmation receipts flooded my inbox. The transition was legally binding, certified by the bankruptcy court, and permanent. I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the sheer magnitude of the morning settle into my bones. I had just purchased my father's empire. The enterprise he spent 3 decades weaponizing against me. The company he used to fund my sister's luxury lifestyle while treating me like an unpaid servant now belonged entirely to me. I stripped away his name, his arrogance, and his corruption, acquiring only the profitable, functional mechanics underneath. I did not execute this acquisition out of a desire to gloat. I did not drive down to the regional warehouse to flaunt my new ownership in front of Todd and Brittany as they pushed heavy cargo pallets across the concrete floor. True victory does not require an audience. The satisfaction derived from this maneuver was purely internal. It was the quiet, profound realization that the discarded son had mathematically engineered his own ascension, transforming a site of familial trauma into a clean, profitable investment. This entire saga illuminated the ultimate form of structural optimization. My professional career was dedicated to fixing broken corporate systems, cutting away toxic liabilities to foster sustainable growth. It took a devastating personal betrayal to realize I needed to apply those exact same principles to my own life. Walking away from a poisonous family dynamic is not an act of surrender. It is the most rigorous, courageous form of risk management a person can undertake. Richard and Helen thought they were asserting their dominance when they skipped my wedding. They assumed their absence would break my spirit, forcing me to fall in line and beg for their conditional approval. They chose to prioritize a baby shower, thinking they were rewarding the golden child while teaching me a lesson in hierarchy. Instead, their calculated cruelty backfired with spectacular precision. They handed me the exact perspective I required to sever the cord. They provided the undeniable, documented proof that I was never a valued son, merely a convenient safety net. By abandoning me at the altar, they unknowingly gave me the permission I needed to stop catching them when they fell. I turned my attention away from the glowing computer monitors and looked at the corner of my glass desk. Resting next to a stack of pristine client folders was a simple silver frame. The photograph inside was captured on a bright June afternoon at the Wichita Botanical Garden. It featured just me and Sarah standing beneath an arbor of blooming jasmine. The composition of the image was tight, focusing entirely on our faces. We were looking directly into the camera, our smiles genuine, relaxed, and brimming with unburdened joy. The empty white folding chairs in the front row were not visible in the frame. The people who refused to show up were entirely irrelevant to the vibrant reality we were building together. We looked entirely self-sufficient, anchored by a mutual respect that no amount of stolen corporate money could ever buy. I reached out and adjusted the silver frame, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the desk. The sunlight caught the glass, illuminating the image. It served as a daily reminder that the foundation of a worthwhile life is never inherited. It is chosen, built, and fiercely protected. Sometimes the people who refuse to show up for your milestones are actually doing you a favor. They are showing you exactly who you do not need in your future.
The corporate ledgers are balanced. The toxic liabilities are permanently liquidated. The future stretches forward unwritten, immaculate, and entirely mine. When we envision the collapse of a family, we often picture a sudden, deafening explosion. We imagine shattered glass, raised voices, and slammed doors echoing through the hallways of a childhood home. But the tragedy of the Ralphie family teaches us a much quieter, far more terrifying truth. The destruction of a lineage rarely begins with a singular, catastrophic event. Instead, it starts decades earlier, buried deep in the soil of everyday parenting choices. It begins with the slow, silent erosion of trust. It takes root the exact moment a parent decides that one child is an investment while another is merely an appliance. In traditional American culture, the family structure is idealized as an impenetrable sanctuary. We are taught that the home should stand as a fortress of fairness, honesty, and emotional security. Parents serve as the architects of that fortress. Their primary responsibility extends far beyond providing shelter or financial stability. Their true mandate is to offer a consistent, unwavering moral compass. Richard and Helen possessed the financial acumen to build a lucrative logistics empire, yet they operated with absolute bankruptcy regarding the foundational values of raising children. They confused material provision with parental guidance. They believed that paying a mortgage and leasing luxury vehicles meant they were exempt from providing emotional safety. In their pursuit of upward mobility and country club prestige, they abandoned the core tenets of family responsibility. They built a house of cards, masquerading as a legacy, failing to realize that wealth without integrity is simply a disaster waiting for an audit. The most profound failure in their parenting lay in their blatant disregard for fairness. Richard and Helen created a toxic hierarchy within their own home, establishing a golden child who could do no wrong and a scapegoat who could never do enough. Brittany was shielded from the harsh realities of adulthood, her extravagant lifestyle subsidized, at the direct cost of the family's integrity. She was taught that love was transactional and that consequences were burdens meant for other people to carry. Jonah, conversely, was expected to shoulder the structural weight of the family's obligations while being perpetually denied a seat at the table. This dynamic operates as a slow-acting poison. When parents demonstrate conditional love, when affection is distributed based on compliance utility or favoritism, they do not just harm the neglected child, they cripple the favored child as well. Brittany and Todd were left entirely unequipped to navigate the real world, relying on stolen funds and parental bailouts to sustain a manufactured reality. By shielding them from accountability, Richard and Helen robbed their favorite daughter of her resilience. True parental guidance requires the courage to let children face the natural consequences of their actions. It demands honesty, even when the truth is deeply uncomfortable. American society places a heavy emphasis on the concept of familial loyalty. We are bombarded with adages insisting that blood is thicker than water, implying that shared DNA demands an endless tolerance for mistreatment. The Ralphie narrative dismantles this dangerous myth. Loyalty is not an inherited right. It is a daily practice. It must be earned through mutual respect, emotional awareness, and consistent care. When parents lack emotional awareness, they become entirely blind to the damage they inflict. Helen could stand in a hospital lobby and accuse her son of destroying the family, entirely oblivious to the fact that she had struck the fatal blow
months earlier by abandoning him on his wedding day. Richard could stand on a frozen porch and demand $250,000, ignoring the fact that he had weaponized his son's identity to commit federal forgery. They expected Jonah to prioritize a family that had actively placed him at the bottom of their own list. They demanded a safety net from the very person they had pushed off the ledge. A healthy family structure requires parents to recognize their children as autonomous human beings with their own boundaries, dreams, and rights. Forging a child's identity to secure a commercial loan is not merely a white-collar crime. It represents the ultimate betrayal of the parental mandate to protect. It transforms a guardian into a predator. The American dream is built on the concept of meritocracy, the idea that you reap what you sow. This principle applies just as rigorously to the family unit as it does to the corporate boardroom. You cannot plant seeds of deceit, favoritism, and exploitation, and then expect to harvest devotion when the winter frost arrives. The bill always comes due. Jonah's actions were not born of malice or theatrical cruelty. He did not seek to destroy his parents out of a petty grudge. He simply held up a mirror to their choices, organized their own financial data, and allowed the natural consequences to take their course. He optimized his life by removing the rot. His triumph illustrates a crucial lesson for anyone raising the next generation. You cannot build a sustainable future on a foundation of lies. If you teach your children that rules do not apply to them, the world will eventually teach them otherwise, and the curriculum will be unforgiving. We all must examine the foundations of our own homes. Are we building fortresses of trust, or are we constructing fragile facades waiting for the wind to change? If you find yourself navigating the complex, often painful dynamics of family betrayal, or if you simply appreciate stories that expose the raw, unfiltered truth of human relationships, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe and follow the Linda Vengeance channel. We explore the deep, hidden fractures in the families we think we know, bringing the silent struggles into the light so we can all learn how to rebuild. As the dust settles on the ruins of the Ralphie family empire, we are left to ponder the quiet spaces in our own lives. The empty chairs at a wedding reception are never just pieces of furniture. They are profound, physical statements of priority. They force us to ask difficult questions about the people we share our blood with. When you sit at your own dinner table tonight, looking at the faces gathered around you, consider the invisible threads connecting you all. Are those threads forged in honesty, mutual respect, and unconditional care? Or are they fraying under the weight of silent expectations and unspoken resentments? We spend our entire lives trying to build a legacy, terrified of what we might lose when the storms come. But perhaps the most haunting question is not what happens when the people we love walk away. Perhaps the truly terrifying thought is realizing that for some, they were never really sitting at the table to begin with.